These are the most interesting historical photos and unusual objects from the past. Let's get 100,000 subscribers. 4-year-old Bobby Dunbar went missing during a family trip in 1912. 8 months later, a boy was found and raised as their son. Almost 100 years later, DNA evidence proved he was not Bobby Dunbar. In 1938, a woman in the Sudetenland wept as her town was taken over and she was pressed into a public salute. The image became a stark record of forced loyalty under the new rule. Frank Goldsmith survived the Titanic in 1912 and later lived in Detroit near a baseball park. On game days, the loud crowd brought back the voices he heard over the dark sea. An American frontier couple poses on their wedding day in 1860, when long exposures made faces look very still. Their family story later inspired the Little House on the Prairie books. In 1888, C.P. Stern sold a vest camera you could wear under a coat for $10 to $15. It made 6 images on one plate, and over 13,000 were sold in 2 years. Scarecrows have guarded fields for thousands of years, from ancient Egypt to farm roads in Europe. Old photos show handmade figures so human-like that birds stayed away and travelers looked twice. These clear human-shaped shells were filled with salt water to copy the body and measure how much radiation a space gave off. Used in labs in the mid-20th century, they helped map safe zones and strange hotspots. Oswald Mosley fell during a planned march in Manchester in 1962 when protesters blocked the route. The halted event showed how street pressure could stop a movement without a vote. An archive photo shows Stalingrad on 2 October 1942, with smoke and dust rising after heavy bombing. The city soon became the site of one of the fiercest urban battles in history. In 1953, a young Ernesto Guevara trekked with a friend on a long mountain trail during his wanderings. These quiet journeys shaped ideas that later made him a world-famous figure. American troops set up tents inside the Forbidden City during the Boxer years of 1900 to 1901. It was a rare moment when foreign soldiers lived in the Emperor's Palace courtyard. In the early 1900s, some schools taught young women to sew full dresses for $1 to learn skill and thrift. This glass negative shows new graduates holding their work with quiet pride. In 1967, the United States ship Liberty returned with deep scars after a friendly fire attack during a war in the Middle East. The event stayed disputed for years, with reports and questions about how it happened. In the late 1950s, students around the world tried to pack as many people as possible into a phone booth. Clubs set records with dozens squeezed inside, turning a simple street box into a short-lived craze. On June 5, 1967, an Israeli Air Force jet flew over a base where 3 Egyptian fighter planes, Model 21, lay destroyed at the start of the Six-Day War. The rapid strike shifted control of the skies within hours. In 1960, Albert Luthuli, leader of the African National Congress, urged people to mourn and stay at home in peaceful protest after a tragic event. This small note became a quiet sign of courage under strict laws. A paratrooper from the United States shows the M1942 jump uniform, with heavy gear strapped to chest and legs for landing. It was standard from 1942 until mid-1944. In 1953, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi stands with his wife Soraya during a public visit in Tehran. The mix of his uniform and her full veil shows a country balancing old customs with new style. Julius Streicher in 1945, publisher of the paper Der Stürmer. At the post-war trials, he was judged responsible for urging mass hatred, a landmark case on speech and harm. John Schrank under arrest in Milwaukee in 1912 after a shooting attempt on Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt kept the bullet in his chest and still gave a 90-minute speech, saved by a metal glasses case and a thick folded copy of his notes. In 1942, on the Eastern Front, a German anti-tank gun crew works behind a field piece caked with mud. Fast, low shots from guns like this could disable armor at close range, buying minutes for retreat or counterattack. A crushed officer cap on the floor of the Berlin bunker in 1945 as the regime collapsed. Quiet relics like this helped investigators trace the last days inside the underground rooms. East Berlin in the 1980s used prefabricated concrete housing and extra-wide boulevards from state planning. The dome and square towers capture the strict lines of socialist modern design. Over 3 million Soviet soldiers were captured in the opening months of 1941. Deliberate ration cuts left many to die behind the wire. Spring 1945, a young German woman stands by a road in Czechoslovakia amid the mass flight after the war. In the following months, about 12 million ethnic Germans were forced from their homes across Eastern Europe. In 1938, Italian laborers arrived by train in Germany for seasonal farm work arranged by the two regimes. Bilateral deals sent tens of thousands north as party flags waved from the windows. Mary Mallon, called Typhoid Mary, was held on North Brother Island in New York in 1915 after repeated outbreaks. She lived there for 23 years, an unseen carrier tied to more than 50 infections. In 1969, Charles Manson stands for his first booking photo in Los Angeles after a headline case. His fringe buckskin outfit became a stark symbol of a cult that shook pop culture and the courts. In the 1980s, Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein visited Mecca and touched the Black Stone. He used public shows of faith even though his party began as a secular movement. In Paris in 1946, Dr. Marcel Petiot stood trial, accused in the deaths of 27 people. A wall of suitcases filled with their belongings stood behind the bench and helped secure his conviction. An Arctic expedition in 1854 recorded one of the first known photographs of an Inuit man with his kayak. The craft used driftwood ribs covered in seal skin, light and strong for gliding through ice-edged water. In 1943, a German submarine crew set up a hidden automatic weather station on the coast of Labrador. It was the only known German military outpost on the North American mainland in that war, found by Canadians in 1981. In 1924, Bertrand Milbourne Clark became the first black man to play at Wimbledon. A descendant later found his records and this rare photo, restoring his place in tennis history. In November 1946, two women in trousers drew stares in Sydney, where slacks for women were still rare after the war. Within a decade, pants became common streetwear as work and fashion norms shifted. October 1944, an elderly Volkssturm recruit studies the outdated Mannlicher rifle he was issued. The militia pulled boys and men from 16 to 60, often with only days of training and mismatched gear. In 1935, Berlin officials under the ruling party removed Gustav Stresemann's name from a street despite his Nobel Peace Prize. After the war, the name returned, a small reversal of the era's memory rewriting. In September 1938, Prague volunteers gave blood at the Red Cross as fears rose over the Sudetenland. Days later, the Munich Agreement ceded the borderlands to Germany, a deal made far away from Prague. February 1943, injured German soldiers sit in the Berlin Sports Palace as Joseph Goebbels demands total war after the setback at Stalingrad. The speech triggered full mobilization, labor, industry, and culture pressed into a non-stop war effort. In 1945 at Los Alamos, scientists prepared parts for the first nuclear test. Within a year, Harry Daghlian and Louis Slotin received lethal doses in two separate criticality accidents with the same plutonium core. In 1938 to 1939, a German expedition led by Ernst Schaefer visited Tibet, meeting local leaders and gathering artifacts. Berlin backed it to chase a supposed ancient link to their Aryan myth, blending research with propaganda. In 1968, a physicist in Bucharest tested an early gas laser at the Institute of Atomic Physics. Labs across Eastern Europe raced to build working lasers within a decade of the first beam in 1960. In 1939, Chinese Americans picketed docks to stop iron shipments bound for Japan. They warned the metal would feed military use in Asia and pushed the United States to end the trade. May 1945, captured boys from the Volkssturm and Hitler Youth stand in Berlin during the city's last days. In the final weeks, the regime drafted tens of thousands of boys as young as 12 to hold the streets. A burned theater in Artemivsk drew a crowd in December 1942 during World War II, with occupation flags on the shattered front. The city is known today as Bakhmut, a name restored in 2016. Streetcars passed the ruins after the Great Chicago Fire that began on October 8, 1871, when dry winds and wooden buildings fed a fast blaze. In 2 days, the disaster reshaped the city and sparked new fire codes that led to the first modern skyscrapers. A teenager watches a coin viewer at a penny arcade in the 1940s, when 1 cent bought a few seconds of moving pictures. Early machines used film loops and flip cards that made tiny screens feel secret. American B-17G, Miss Donna May 2, was hit by a bomb from a friendly plane over Berlin on May 19, 1944. The impact tore off the left tail wing and the plane spun out of control, and all 11 crew were lost. Tank cars carry Soviet oil to Germany after a trade pact signed in February 1940. Under the deal, the Soviet side sent fuel and grain, while Germany sent machines and tools. Robert Nixon, age 18, stood with police during a staged reenactment in Chicago in 1938. Harsh and biased news reports on his case later inspired Richard Wright's novel Native Son. A police officer with a compact carbine stands guard during an anti-vice sweep in Moscow in the 1990s. The short AKS-74U was favored by patrol units for tight spaces and vehicle use. Artists at Walt Disney Studios paint the Dopey Drive sign around 1940, when the studio used playful street names on its lot. These signs guided teams making classics like Pinocchio and Fantasia. Marilyn Monroe greets an injured service member in Japan on February 5, 1954, just before a morale tour in Korea. Days later, she performed 10 shows for more than 100,000 service members in freezing air. People in Leningrad gathered under a street loudspeaker on June 22, 1941, hearing that Germany had begun an invasion of the Soviet Union. Within hours, the city moved to wartime duty, and a siege later lasted 872 days. Isidore Greenbaum rushed the stage at a German-American Bund rally in New York in 1939 to confront Speaker Fritz Julius Kuhn. Guards pulled him away as the hall watched, a rare moment of open defiance. An abandoned narrow-gauge locomotive sits at a Rote airfield on Guam on October 5, 1944, 2 months after the island was declared secure. Light rail like this moved fuel and supplies for airfield work across short tracks on many Pacific islands. Osama bin Laden stands with Mujahideen in Afghanistan in 1988 during the Soviet-Afghan War. He became known for funding and building supply routes and base camps along the Pakistan border. A museum worker in Mobile, Alabama, in 1937 models a bell rack, a collar once used to track enslaved people. Its tall iron arm held a bell that rang if the wearer left the road or pushed through brush. Berliners clear bricks by the Reichstag in 1946 during the first harsh months after the war. Women called Rubble Women moved millions of tons of debris to restart the city. Bandaged survivors after anti-Jewish violence in Khodorkovsky in 1919 during the Russian Civil War. Historians estimate that more than 100,000 Jewish people in Ukraine lost their lives in that period. German troops inspect a wooden frame in 1941 during actions against Soviet resistance. Public punishments were used by occupation forces to keep control in the East. After the Johnstown flood on May 31, 1889, more than 2,200 lives were lost as a wall of water hit the valley. This scene shows Captain West's house jammed in a huge debris pile where his family somehow survived. Soldiers in clown suits known as the Balmorals pose in Chellers, France on May 7, 1917. They toured the British 51st Division to lift spirits between battles. Crowds packed the street outside the Washington Star on November 4, 1924, watching results on outdoor screens. Calvin Coolidge won, and papers used lantern slides to flash totals almost in real time. Heavy rain on November 8, 1977, turned parts of New York City and New Jersey into slow rivers. That night, President Jimmy Carter spoke on energy and conservation, shaping fuel policy for years. Beijing, around 1946, shows the table where the local Japanese commander signed surrender papers in 1945 inside the palace. Behind it stand people in ancient palace guard costumes, with the imperial throne in the back. A visiting German leader is served a non-alcoholic fruit dessert at the 75th birthday lunch of Finland's commander-in-chief in Imatra on June 4, 1942. That same day, Finland captured the only known candid audio of his voice during a quiet train talk with the host. An Asian conscript in a German uniform is recorded by American troops in 1944. He is known as Yang Kyung-jong. His unusual path forced him to serve in 3 armies across Asia and Europe before capture. NAACP members in New York stand outside a theater in 1947, calling for a boycott of the film The Birth of a Nation. They warned that the movie spread false myths and stirred prejudice for years. German guards at Majdanek hold cans of Zyklon B in July 1944, soon before the camp was exposed to the world. The men shown were later tried and hanged for crimes at the site. Miners pause in a South African gold reef around 1900, a rare mixed crew working by lamplight far below ground. The Witwatersrand soon supplied much of the world's gold and turned a farm into the city of Johannesburg. Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip welcomed President John Kennedy and Jacqueline Kennedy at Buckingham Palace in June 1961. It was a bright moment of early Cold War diplomacy and high style. A Soviet defector named Nikolai Koklov turned over covert tools to West German police in 1954. He revealed cigarette case guns and wired devices after refusing a secret mission in Frankfurt. Sailors paint a scoreboard on the quarterdeck wall of the aircraft carrier Enterprise on August 20, 1944, listing planes downed and ships sunk. The Enterprise became the most decorated American carrier of the war, earning 20 battle stars. Jacqueline Kennedy watches the first televised presidential debate from her living room on September 26, 1960, as John Kennedy faces Richard Nixon. Many viewers said television changed the race that night, showing how image could shape modern politics. Empress Elizabeth of Austria walks in Terratet, Switzerland on September 3, 1898, 1 week before her death. She died in Geneva on September 10 after a sudden street attack by an anarchist while boarding a lake boat. Fidel Castro teaches a countryside man to use a rifle during the Cuban Revolution. The thatched huts behind them are bohayos, common rural homes for many descendants of enslaved people in the Caribbean. 2 years after the Battle of the Somme, New Zealand soldiers raised a giant wooden cross for their fallen friends. This photo shows 2 men digging the base for the memorial on the old front line. Rescuers lower listening gear at the Colebrook mine in South Africa in January 1960 after a collapse trapped hundreds underground. 435 miners were never brought out, and the rescue ended 2 weeks later. Red Cross volunteers sew face masks during the influenza pandemic in 1918 under a banner that says, "If I fail, he dies." The outbreak lasted until 1920 and took tens of millions of lives worldwide. Mount St. Helens erupts on May 18, 1980, recorded on film by Robert Landsberg near the blast zone. He shielded the camera roll so the photos survived, and he lost his life moments later. Pages from the diary of 11-year-old Tanya Savicheva in besieged Leningrad, each line marking a relative and the date they passed. Her last lines say all were gone and only Tanya remained. She passed from illness on July 1, 1944. Young Joseph Ratzinger, later Pope Benedict XVI, raises both hands during a church rite. Years later, a tight crop of this photo was used to claim he made a political salute, showing how framing can twist truth. On the Silo Heights in April 1945, rescuers used dog teams to pull stretchers through ruined streets. It was part of the final drive toward Berlin when speed meant faster rescue. Berlin in May 1945, with people moving past broken blocks and rail cars in a ruined street. The war ended days later, and the city began years of clearing and rebuilding. Soviet explorers reached the Antarctic pole of inaccessibility on December 14, 1958, and set up a small station. They placed a frost-proof bust of Lenin on the roof, a lonely statue facing endless ice. A dentist pulls a child's tooth with a hand tool in 1920, when home visits and kitchen chairs were common. Within decades, numbing medicine, better tools, and X-rays changed care for the whole world. Julius Duke stands in a police station in Chicago in 1906 after arrest for wearing women's clothes, which city rules then forbade. Many U.S. cities had such laws for decades before they were repealed in the late 1960s and 1970s. 1 month after the atomic blast, Hiroshima lay in open ruins with roads and stone frames as the only guides. Heat and shock erased wooden neighborhoods, and the rebuild later shaped a planned peace city. In 1866, tiny Liechtenstein sent 80 men to war and returned with 81 after meeting a friendly Italian near the front. No one from the unit was lost, and the new friend chose to come home with them. In 1890, near Killarney, County Kerry, a barefoot mother carries a peat basket while her small children rest by the path. Peat from Irish bogs dried into turf kept cottages warm for cooking and heat. This lantern was carried by Guy Fawkes on the night of November 5/16/05 during the Gunpowder Plot. The plan to light powder under Parliament and remove King James I was found out before it began. A new sailor takes part in a crew initiation on the landing ship USS Dodge County in 1969. Shipmates toss eggs and splash water as part of the rite at sea. Job seekers crowd the Ford plant in 1914 after the company raised pay to $5 a day. The bold change cut turnover and helped grow the middle class in the assembly line age. Captured German airmen line up for a record photo after a raid on Kiev on June 25, 1941, just 3 days after the Eastern Front began. Their flight ended on the city's edge as the air war opened fast. A steam tug breaks lake ice in Chicago in 1935 as smoke drifts past the Wrigley and Tribune Towers. Winter ice could trap freighters for days, so tugs carved lanes to keep trade moving. Former prisoners showed General Dwight Eisenhower the devices and positions used to abuse them at the Ohrdruf camp in 1945. He ordered wide records and witness reports so no one could deny what had happened. A young courier from the Home Army fixes her hair after a raid during the Warsaw Uprising in September 1944. Many messengers were teenage girls who crossed ruins to carry orders through sewers and streets. Abby Stockton, 5'2" and 115 pounds, lifts 135 pounds with one arm on a California beach in 1946. The Muscle Beach star helped spark modern women's strength sports and showed that power can look joyful. Workers thread thousands of steel wires into the Brooklyn Bridge cables in the 1880s, shaping a new skyline link. To calm fears, P.T. Barnum marched 21 elephants across in 1884 to show its strength. An overland car drives down the steps of Sydney Town Hall in the 1920s to prove tire grip and spring strength. Daring street demos like this helped sell early cars before safety tests and television ads. Raleigh Free lines up at the Bonneville Salt Flats in Utah in 1948, moments before his daring speed run. Minutes later, he lay flat in a bathing suit and set over 150 miles per hour, creating an iconic racing image. U.S. ordnance officers test heavy steel body armor in France in 1918, with dents from pistols and tears from rifles and machine guns. The plates were so heavy most troops refused them, but the trials shaped later armor designs. Civilians cook over a small fire in the ruins of Stalingrad in October 1942 as the city was split street by street. Many families sheltered in cellars and holes to survive cold and shortage. Months after the Warsaw Uprising, the city lies in endless rubble, with only a few walls standing in 1945. Wide, empty blocks mark where whole neighborhoods vanished. An amateur bodybuilder practices poses in a living room in the 1950s, with a record player by his side. Early home training was simple, yet this era shaped classic poses used for decades. German pilot Franz von Vera lets his pet lion cub Simba explore a plane wing during World War II. He became famous for an escape in Britain in 1941 and returning to fly again. Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret speak on the BBC program Children's Hour in 1940, sending a message to children who had left their homes during the war. The 15-year-old future queen promised hope and calm from Windsor Castle. An Oglala girl sits by a teepee in South Dakota in 1891 with her small dog at her side. Canvas covers were replacing tanned hides then, but the lodge design still vented smoke and held warm air. A long ware-kai stands at Te Paho Marae near Poroporo in 1899, built for a governor's visit. The thatched hall could feed about 400 guests during hui on the meeting grounds. Penn State students relax in a packed dorm room in 1914, with pennants and tennis rackets hung like trophies. Rooms like this had no radio or phone, and students shared baths down the hall. Lieutenant Colonel R.D. Garrett checks a field phone left by retreating troops near St. Mihiel in 1918. Signal units strung wire through ruins to link front lines with maps and guns. United States Marines of the 27th Regiment pause on the black sand of Iwo Jima on February 1945, just after landing. An armored amphibious tractor waits behind them as units push in from Red Beach 1. Women train in China in 1970 as one lifter does a close stance squat with about 61 kilograms. Women's strength sport in China would later boom, producing world records and Olympic gold. A Hungarian soldier paints a village woman in the Soviet Union in 1942 during the occupation. On the Eastern Front, some troops kept sketchbooks, capturing quiet faces amid a harsh campaign. Czechoslovak soldiers escort a suspected collaborator to a local court in Telch in May 1945, days after liberation. Across the country, swift people's tribunals judged wartime cooperation with the occupiers. Before she was princess, Diana worked at Young England Kindergarten in London in 1980. She was the first future royal bride with a paid job, and photographers found her here. A blast at the Standard Oil Refinery in Whiting, Indiana, on August 27, 1955, sent a black cloud over nearby homes. At least 2 lives were lost, and fires fed by huge fuel stores burned for 8 days. Marilyn Monroe visits a children's hospital in Atlantic City in August 1952, signing photos and chatting with patients. She was in town for Miss America Week, and the stop turned a publicity trip into a bright memory for the kids. A street performer in Berlin in 1919 balances a seated soldier on his chin, a bold show of strength and control. Such acts were common in the hard first years after the war, when many used skill shows to earn coins. Fanny Virginia Cassiopeia Lawrence, age 5, was freed and photographed in 1863 to show how race laws could classify a light-skinned child. The picture helped abolition workers raise support to end slavery and aid freed families. Red Army soldiers stand behind barbed wire moments after U.S. troops freed their camp in France in 1944. Many Soviet prisoners had been used for hard labor across Europe, and some later aided the Allies as guides and interpreters on the road home. Amphibious ships land at Incheon on September 15, 1950, a risky plan chosen for its 30-foot tides and narrow channels. The surprise entry helped United Nations forces break the siege at the south and move to retake Seoul. JFK drives a pack of laughing nieces and nephews on a golf cart at the Kennedy compound in Hyannisport, August 1961. The bright Kodachrome scene shows the relaxed side of a new president during a summer marked by the Berlin crisis. Elvis and Priscilla smile as they show baby Lisa Marie in February 1968, the only child of the star. She was born in Memphis and later became the heir to Graceland, turning this family moment into a piece of music history. In October 1943, Danish fishers raced across the Öresund at night, ferrying families to neutral Sweden, about 7,500 people in days. This nationwide rescue meant that 99% of Denmark's Jewish community survived the war. Soviet troops crossed into eastern Poland in September 1939, knocking down a striped border post as the Red Army advanced under the hidden terms of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Within weeks, the USSR and Germany divided the country along agreed lines, shifting borders and uprooting millions. Tourists in Las Vegas set alarm clocks for dawn and drove to the Nevada test site, where casinos promoted blast breakfasts as clouds rose just 65 miles away. Hotels printed viewing schedules and served atomic cocktails, turning Cold War tests into a surreal desert attraction. At Rabaul in 1945, Australian troops ran identification parades where civilians, including a young Chinese girl, pointed out Japanese suspects from the former garrison. Many of those identified were later tried by Australian military courts in Rabaul for offenses during the occupation. American Red Cross nuns serve hot meals and even cigarettes to U.S. and Allied troops at a Bordeaux canteen in 1918. By war's end, the Red Cross ran hundreds of such canteens across France, lifting morale with millions of meals, drinks, and comforts. Prague, 1934. Police separate Czech and ethnic German students at Charles University after a clash over who could display the school's medieval insignia, an argument rooted in the campus's long split into Czech and German faculties since 1882. Chicago's lakefront in 1923. Crews build Municipal Grant Park Stadium on New Lakeville beside the just-opened Field Museum, remaking the shoreline. Renamed Soldier Field in 1925, it soon drew six-figure crowds. Marcella Miller wears the Miss Coney Island 1925 sash on the boardwalk, with the 1924 winner beside her. Pure jazz-age glamour and the new, shorter swimwear. These seaside contests drew huge crowds and helped turn beauty pageants into national entertainment, paving the way for the Miss America era. A teenager makes it over the Berlin Wall to West Berlin in the early 1960s, when barbed wire and brick were still replacing open streets overnight. From 1961 to 1989, about 5,000 people escaped the 155-kilometer barrier of fences. Cole Bros performers Gene Sleater and Kay Clark smile for a fan on August 31, 1953. Their sequined show outfits glowing in rich Kodachrome color. In the 1950s, Cole Bros was one of America's biggest tented circuses. Ruhr, 1923. A German civilian faces a French soldier during the French and Belgian control of this coal heartland, a tense street moment from the occupation. The push to secure unpaid reparations sparked passive resistance, stalled industry. Crews burned straw and used smudge pots to thaw Wrigley Field's frozen turf before the National Football Championship in December 1937. The Chicago Bears still played home games at the baseball park then. A rare view of Yerevan in 1920, its streets damaged after the Turkish-Armenian War. Within a decade, architect Alexander Tumanian began a bold plan that rebuilt the city with wide squares and avenues. In the 1910s, crowds in Taksim Square watched an Ottoman army balloon rise into the sky. These gas balloons were early eyes for spotting troop moves long before radar. United States Marine Charles Lindbergh stands on Mount Suribachi, Iwo Jima, in 1945. He helped raise the first flag that day and served as a flamethrower operator in the push up the volcano. German school children view a World War II exhibit called The Land Calls You, with a settler wagon beside a fallen Polish border sign. Such shows shaped a state narrative for the young, turning art into a quiet tool of influence. A Fokker D-7 pilot in about 1917 shows an early oxygen set for high flights. This gear let aviators work in thin air above 6,000 meters, a quiet leap for long climbs. Life's special issue captures Buzz Aldrin climbing down Eagle's ladder during the first moon landing in 1969. The ladder ended about 3 feet short, so he had to hop onto the surface. Pittsburgh YMCA swim team, February 1947, gathered by the pool after winter training. At a time when many pools were not open to everyone, YMCA teams helped grow talent and access. In 1950, workers rebuilt the inside of the White House from the ground up. Harry Truman had the whole interior replaced with a steel frame after his piano leg went through a floor in 1948. Volunteers serve hot meals to children in 1918 while wearing masks during the global influenza. That outbreak reached about 1/3 of people on Earth and spurred new habits like masks and open-air kitchens. Jane Russell and Marilyn Monroe pressed their hands into wet cement at the Chinese Theater on June 26, 1953. The moment promoted their film Gentlemen Prefer Blondes and fixed them in Hollywood tradition. Mamoru Shigemitsu stands beside General Yoshijiro Umezu, waiting to sign Japan's surrender aboard the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945. His top hat and cane made a calm, formal image as the long conflict officially closed. Billie Holiday sings at a late-night jam led by life photographer Gyeon Millie. Her deep, airy style helped shape modern jazz, and songs like Strange Fruit and God Bless the Child became lasting landmarks. September 1938, crowds in Budapest protest against Czechoslovakia during the Sudeten crisis, holding portraits of leaders they support. Days later, the Munich Agreement redrew maps across Central Europe. Prague, September 1938. Families from the Sudetenland rest in a Czech shelter after fleeing unrest. Weeks later, the Munich Agreement split the land and pushed hundreds of thousands to move again. Women run power looms in a Whitney blanket mill around 1890, working 10 to 12-hour shifts amid belts and gears. Whitney was known worldwide for thick wool blankets used at home and on horses. Crowds at Hellerup Station send off Frikorps Denmark in 1941, arms raised from windows and platforms. These volunteers served under German command on the Eastern Front, and the unit counted about 6,000 men. Insurgents in the Warsaw Uprising hold a ruined doorway at Holy Cross Church in August 1944. They used the church's high walls as cover on Krakowskie Przedmieście while guiding people through rubble. A Grumman Avenger torpedo plane flies above the beaches near Tacloban on 20 October 1944. This marked the return to the Philippines and opened the largest sea fight in history at Leyte Gul. Ellen Watson, called Cattle Kate, rides on the Wyoming Range in the early 1880s. Years later, powerful ranchers pushed a false rustling story that led to her death and a long Wyoming legend. 2 Victorian houses lean after the San Francisco earthquake of 1906, shaken off their foundations. The quake and fires damaged much of the city, and the San Andreas Fault slid about 6 meters. Santa Anita Park, April 1942. A Japanese-American woman has her suitcase inspected before entering a wartime relocation center. Under Executive Order 9066, over 100,000 people of Japanese ancestry were moved to such centers. New York City, 1911, a memorial march honors the Triangle Shirtwaist workers who lost their lives. Public grief pushed the city to pass strong factory safety rules, from outward opening exits to sprinklers. Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941. Sailors watch smoke rise as crew leave the battleship California. She sank in shallow water that morning, was raised and rebuilt, and later sailed back into action. August 6, 1945. 2 minutes after a new atomic device was used, a vast cloud rose over Hiroshima. This moment opened the nuclear age and reshaped world power. Television reshaped politics in 1960 as Richard Nixon debated John Kennedy live. Many radio listeners thought Nixon did better, but many television viewers favored Kennedy's calm look. 3 survivors from Hiroshima stand for a rare portrait in 1945. The city later rebuilt, and every August 6 lanterns drift on the river in a quiet peace rite. Rome, 1860. Crowds fill St. Peter's Square as the Pope gives a public blessing from the Great Basilica. Soon after, Italian unification cut the Papal States and reshaped the land around the Vatican. Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey circus crew pose with visitors on August 28, 1954, captured in vivid Kodachrome. The show moved its whole city by train, with performers and animals living on rolling stock between towns. Mule teams and graders carve a desert cut near Barstow for the road that would become Route 66 in 1917. In 1926, the highway linked Chicago to Santa Monica, turning this rough track into a famous drive. Young people in Vogelsburg in 1934 share beer beneath a party slogan as politics seep into daily life. That year, the top offices were merged and loyalty oaths spread through schools and clubs. Bass Reeves, born into slavery, became a United States Deputy Marshal in 1875 and rode the Indian Territory. He made thousands of arrests using clever disguises and was never hit by a bullet on duty. A Harlem figure steps out in a chinchilla coat and hat in the 1970s, a look said to cost about $100,000. Worn at a big boxing bout, it drew sharp attention from press and officials. A towering beehive hairdo from the 1960s stands like a small sculpture. The style, created in 1960 by Margaret Vincy Helt, used heavy hairspray to keep its height. North American F-51D Mustangs line up at Chinhae Airfield in South Korea in 1951 as crews refuel them. Renamed from P-51 to F-51 after 1948, these fast planes still flew ground support in the jet age. Evelyn Smith flexes on Santa Monica sand in the 1940s, one of Hollywood's go-to stunt women. She worked the Muscle Beach scene and doubled leading ladies when films needed bold falls and lifts. May 1933, German students and Party Storm Division members unload books for a public burning in Berlin. That night, more than 20,000 works, including titles by Einstein and Mann, were burned in 34 cities. July 20, 1944, 2 United States officers raise a flag on Guam just 8 minutes after the first landing. The island, a United States territory, soon became a vital base for long-range flights across the Pacific. Rebuilding posters filled Leningrad in 1945, calling people to raise new walls after a long siege. Artists mixed hope and labor in bright street panels that turned sidewalks into open-air galleries. A British soldier braces as a Red Cross nurse gives an injection on the Russian front. Britain sent troops to North Russia in 1918 to support allies at Archangel and Murmansk. Smoke rolls over the Thames by Tower Bridge during the first Blitz raid in 1940. Docklands burned that night, but the city kept running by morning. Benito Mussolini reviews Italian troops in 1940 beneath a long line of guns. Months later, Italy entered the conflict, and his grand plans began to unravel. Neville Chamberlain meets Adolf Hitler in 1938 during tense talks over Czechoslovakia. Weeks later, the Munich Agreement brought a brief calm that opened the way to a wider war. Berlin, August 1, 1914. Officers post the mobilization notice as boys watch in the Tiergarten. Within days, Europe moved by rail on strict timetables, and millions were in uniform. In Palermo on September 3, 1943, Bernard Montgomery, George Patton, and Jeffrey Keyes study a large map of Sicily. That same day, Italy signed a secret armistice as they planned the push toward the mainland. General Douglas MacArthur steps through the surf at Leyte in October 1944, returning as he promised. The photo by Carl Meidens turned a wet landing into a symbol of resolve seen around the world. British soldiers in a shell hole use a daylight signaling lamp in 1916. The Aldi's lamp flashed Morse across miles when radios were heavy and lines were cut. Hamburg, 1933. A public bonfire consumes banned books as a crowd stands by. Within months, many authors left the country, and some libraries quietly hid what they could. 1961. New Yorkers pose in clear suits with an emergency life pack on a balcony. Civil defense ads sold simple home kits for 8 days of water and food during tense times. Anna Swan of Nova Scotia was billed as the tallest woman of her century and toured with Barnum's show. She stood about 7 feet 11 inches and later married Martin Bates, building a home with extra tall doors. 2 members of the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps in France carry supplies in captured German helmets, turning gear into market baskets. In 1917 and 1918, thousands of WAACs served as drivers, cooks, and clerks near the front lines. United States Marines watch a Corsair fighter hit a ridge during the Chausson Reservoir Battle on December 6, 1950. The cold dropped below -30 degrees, and steady air support helped the column break out. Main Street in Gadsden, Alabama, fills with shoppers under holiday lights on December 21, 1940. A year later, rationing and new rules would change these bright streets. Home Army fighters take cover among broken bricks during the Warsaw Uprising in 1944. For 63 days, they held parts of the city, sending messages through sewers and hidden radios. German troops cross a long pontoon bridge over the Brahe River at Bromberg, now Bydgoszcz, on September 5, 1939. In the first week of the Poland campaign, engineers raised quick bridges so cars and guns could keep moving. People in a Dutch village kneel bareheaded in the street in 1944 to honor 4 neighbors killed during the retreat of the occupying forces. Silent public mourning like this was a brave act under wartime rule and kept community spirit alive. Finnish engineers pull gear from a river after a timber bridge gave way under German tanks in 1941. In the far north, many wooden spans could not bear heavy armor, so units carried pontoons to rebuild fast. Survivors of the battleship Scharnhorst step ashore in Britain after the Battle of the North Cape in December 1943. Only 36 of nearly 2,000 crew were pulled from the cold Barents Sea by Royal Navy destroyers. A guard hands food through a fence at a Finnish wartime camp for Soviet civilians in Petrozavodsk between 1941 and 1944. The site held families during the occupation, and this rare photo shows a brief moment of contact. People at Dachau raised the American flag to greet arriving troops in 1945. The moment marked the camp's liberation and the end of their captivity. Women from Guadeloupe arrive at Ellis Island in 1911, wearing Madras head wraps and Sunday dresses. That year, the station processed over 1 million newcomers, including French Caribbean travelers with French passports. A young Jimmy Carter in Navy uniform sits beside Rosalind as newlyweds in 1946. They were married for 77 years, the longest presidential marriage in United States history. October 5, 1945, a long strike by studio set decorators erupted at the Warner Brothers Gate, later called Hollywood Black Friday. The clash pushed studio labor reforms and reshaped work rules across the lots. Detroit, March 12, 1932. About 80,000 people gather for a funeral after the Ford Hunger March. The tragedy pushed the city and auto firms to address jobless relief and worker safety. Alabama, 1956. A man helps girls reach a store fountain marked white only. Such signs were common under Jim Crow laws, and photos like this helped push change. Albion, New York, September 1937. The first Santa training school opens, founded by Charles Howard. Trainees learned reindeer names, gentle crowd work, and how to keep the red suit perfect. Ellis Island, 1908. A mother from Russia holds her 11-month-old baby, noted at 55 pounds by the intake nurse. Inspectors recorded height, weight, and health for each newcomer before entry. Fans in Green Bay carry a piece of the goalpost down Adams Street after the Packers beat the New York Giants 37-0 on December 31, 1961. It was Coach Vince Lombardi's first pro football title, the start of a long run. Clerks line up for morning inspection at a Piggly Wiggly in the 1950s. This chain pioneered self-service shopping in 1916, bringing price tags, aisles, and checkout lanes to modern stores. Daisy Herbert carries a block of ice for home ice boxes in New Jersey around 1930. Electric refrigerators became common only in the late 1930s, so daily ice routes kept food cold. Young women practice a fast throw in a judo class, 1950s. Post-war dojos spread across cities, teaching balance and leverage to people of all ages. A street food truck in Montreal in 1947 sells fried potatoes and hot dogs from a small van. Quebec vendors called them patates frites, and trucks like this fed shift workers outside plants and stadiums. Louisa Madame Lou Bunch was a noted business owner in Central City, Colorado, during the gold rush. When illness swept the camps, she and her staff cared for miners and won lasting local thanks. In Denver, Pitmaster Daddy Bruce Randolph began serving free Thanksgiving barbecue in 1963. He fed thousands for 25 years, turning one small shop into a city tradition. A crowded open-air market in Chicago in the 1920s fills the street with pushcarts and many tongues. Maxwell Street became a landmark for newcomers, street food, and early Chicago blues. Women run belt-driven lathes at Horwich Works in May 1917, the long belts overhead turning from a single power shaft. With many men away, Britain trained thousands of women to build engines and parts that kept railways and factories moving. Brooklyn, January 8, 1917. Margaret Sanger, Ethel Byrne, and Fania Mindell leave court during their trial for opening a family planning clinic. Their case pushed New York to ease old mailing laws in 1918 and helped start modern public health care for mothers. A 1910 ad for Sanitol tooth powder promised clean teeth and fresh breath for 25 cents. Before modern paste became common in the 1950s, many brushed with dry powders like this from a St. Louis maker. Leopold Loika rides a motorbike years before his fateful drive in Sarajevo in 1914. A wrong turn placed the Archduke's car beside Gavrilo Princip, a moment that sparked the Great War. June 4, 1985, North Davidson County, Tennessee. Janet Pewitt holds hailstones so large they cracked her family's truck windshield. Hail this size grows in strong rotating updrafts and can hit at highway speeds, turning a short storm into an expensive icefall. Outside Studio 54 in Manhattan, the real show started at the Velvet Rope, where Dorman chose the crowd in seconds. From April 1977 to January 1980, the disco mixed art, fashion, and famous guests, then shut after a tax case but set the blueprint for modern nightlife. In 1903, Ivor Johnson advertised its safety automatic revolver for $4.50, highlighting a safety hammer and the bold line, "Accidental discharge impossible." Based in Fitchburg, Massachusetts, the brand appealed to police and everyday buyers by mail order. In World War I, French engineers crouched in hand-dug shafts and used early geophones to catch the faint scrape of enemy tunneling far away.